Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to be talking about social networks. Last week we were talking about kinship as a set of relationships. That is a type of social network, but that one is based on biology, on the relationships we have between people who are our kin. We have a lot more relationships than that in our lives. And so today we want to look at some of the other types of relationships and how they work together. When we meet somebody and have a connection with them, we see them say something like, hey, and then we go to a point of saying, I like you. Then we say, hey, let's be friends. We in our own culture know what the word friend means. Again, it's an achieved status. We gain the role of a friend. But what do you know about how that happens in another culture? How do you become friends in another culture? How do you make that connection? What makes that connection secure? What allows for that connection? Are there certain roles and obligations within the status of friends that don't exist in our own culture? Are friendships transient or more permanent? In our culture, it tends to be a bit transient. We have friends, we break friends. In other cultures, it might be much more engaged, much more lifelong and permanent, and therefore a deeper relationship than we might give to it. And then we have to ask the question within any culture, who gets to be friends with who? And on what basis and why? Who's allowed to be friends with you and who's not allowed to be friends with you? Friendship is just one of the many relationship sets within which we function in our culture. In Western culture, we kind of put it on a pedestal as sort of an ultimate relationship, and we set high goals and dreams for friendship. And we're often very disappointed by those. So the way this works is that we are made for connections. If you think about that, how do you make connections with other people? How do you engage with somebody nearby? We use all of our senses, and that is what I mean when I say we are made for connections. God has created us in such a way that every aspect of our physicality creates the opportunity for connections to take place. We hear things, we hear the voice of a stranger, we might like that voice. We see people, they might be attractive to us or repulsive to us. Different people hit us in different ways. And sometimes that first impression is so critically important, even if it's a wrong first impression. But there are other ways in which we connect as well. Through hearing, through sight, we connect through touch, obviously. We connect to people through our conversations, through intellectual engagement, person to person. We connect through things that we don't even think about. For instance, they say now that humans actually have a very keen sense of smell, but that we generally don't use it. But that we actually, without knowing it, can identify some of our closest friends by their smell when they walk in the room. We just don't ever think about the fact that that's what we've done. We connect through smells, smells that are familiar, smells that are pleasant to us, smells that are welcoming to us. So there's a number of ways in which we connect with other people, and all of our senses are connecting. And so that idea of being made for connections leads us to interact with people who we don't know and make new connections all the time. Every time we meet another human being, we're making a connection. That might be a very short-lived connection. It might be very temporary because something happens within that connection that creates discomfort for us. That very first connection may disconnect quickly. But every time we make a connection, we're actually assessing it. I don't think we like to think of ourselves as judging people all the time. But every time you make a connection with a stranger, internally, you're asking the question, was that good? Was it valuable? Was it pleasant? Was it safe? All sorts of questions are running through your subconscious mind as you're interacting with people. Those connections might be based on wrong impressions or past wrongs. For instance, you might look at somebody and they remind you of somebody you don't like or somebody that hurt your feelings. Even though this isn't that person, you still resist the connection because something about them reminds you of something that's uncomfortable to you. So based on how we answer the questions of is it pleasurable, is it safe, is it good, is it valuable, we determine if further development of the relationship is a good idea or a bad idea. Even meeting a total stranger at a grocery store, we engage in just a light banter. Hey, good morning. Hi, how are you doing? Excuse me, can you hand me the pickles there? It creates a sense of, did that feel good? And should I ever consider making more of a formal introduction to this person and getting to know them better? So, you're at a party and you overhear somebody telling a funny story and you think the story's hilarious. And you think, wow, I want to hear more stories like that. So you move closer, hoping that person tells another story. And you might think, what an interesting person. I wonder who they are. And you ask around at the party, who's that person over there? And you find out something about them. Maybe you get brave and go up and talk with them and say, that was a hilarious story you told a while ago. Is that true? Did that really happen? Now you're making an intentional connection. From that initial connection, you're moving to a very intentional connection. You might actually watch out for this person in public space. So when you're walking around, you might notice this person elsewhere and remember, oh, that's the person I saw at the party who told a great story. And you might stop them then and say, hey, I met you at Joe's party the other night. You do this because you have some sense of connection. It creates this thing that allows for a relationship to build. Now, out of connection, we build context. The way context works is the context of your relationship, the environment of your relationship, and the memories that each of you have of that environment, the setting, the place, the time, what people were wearing, what music was playing, all of those things are built into that connection that creates a point of memory for you. And if all of that context comes together in a way that feels comfortable, feels good, and creates a sense of warmth and solidarity or calm within us, if we feel positive about it, then we have this context to build from that might allow us now to move further in that relationship. Let me give you an example story that actually happened to me. I was at a conference in a hotel in California while I was doing my PhD. And I came out of my hotel room one morning and I was on the third floor. I went down the hall to the elevator. And as I turned around the corner, another fellow came down the other hall of the building and turned the corner at the same time. And we walked to the center and met at the elevator. One of us pushed the button and we waited for the elevator. Just to be nice, we both said hi. We got on the elevator and we did what people on elevators always do. We don't say anything. We just stood side by side and went to the bottom floor. The next morning, I come around the corner and there's the same guy and we walk to the elevator. And now we have a context because we've had a connection already. Neither of us threatened each other. We both felt safe in the situation. Nothing weird happened. So there's a little bit of a context built and a memory built that creates a sense of safe environment. And so we didn't do much chatter, but it was kind of like, hey, how are you this morning? Fine. Enjoying the conference? Yeah. You too? The previous day we hadn't talked, but the second day we did. The reason we did is because we had made a secure connection and the context was allowing us to build on that connection. The third day of the conference, same thing happened. I don't know how our timing was that amazing, but third day we get on the elevator together. And of course, now we laugh about it because we have this shared funny experience about this random event of riding elevator 3 times together in a week and under almost identical circumstances. And so it creates a story that allows us to get to know each other. We exchange names and talked a little more deeply than we had before. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I talk about this context that we build around relationships and connections. You connect with somebody, and because that connection is safe, because that connection makes you feel good, because there's solidarity involved, then you move to the next level. If that second encounter goes well, it builds something we would call commitment. And that commitment is several connections having been made with nothing breaking it, nothing disrupting it, everything going well. Therefore, we make a step forward and become more intentional about this relationship. And so that's the time you say, hey, I really enjoyed talking to you. What are you doing on Friday? I'm hanging out with a group of friends. You want to come along? You invite them to something. That invitation is now moving from just a connection to a level of commitment to each other. We've had some good experiences that felt safe, felt good. Are we ready now to schedule time together? Are you ready now to get together on an intentional basis? That takes commitment. So in order for that to happen, the context has to build enough so that you feel secure. That's how relationships happen all the time. There's so many variations, but relationships just build that way. You meet people, you build connection, you build context, and you come to commitment. The other side of that, though, is the dark side, I suppose. Sometimes we make those connections, initial connection, and something happens that it doesn't go well. Maybe it's on the second or third or fourth connection, and somebody, because of previous connections and the context it's built, pushes the agenda further than you want it to go and says something too familiar, and the relationship's not ready for that level of connection. And so the connection breaks. Now there's no opportunity for commitment because the context now becomes spoiled. And within the context, you have now kind of an aura of, this isn't safe. This isn't good. I'm not comfortable with this situation. That can happen on the first connection. It can happen on the second. It can happen on the 30th. It can happen after a lot of context is built, and it can even happen after a lot of commitment is built, that something ruptures that relationship. And there's a lot of things that can disturb this. You know, when Adam and Eve first sinned, what's the first reaction they had to their sin was they hide in the garden and sow fig leaves for themselves and hide from each other. And so what they experienced was shame, which we talked about earlier. Because of their sin, they experienced shame. And because of their shame, they weren't comfortable around each other, not as completely comfortable around each other as they had been. They both came to a realization at that moment that if I can sin against God, I could sin against you. Trust was broken. Ever since then, we've been plagued by shame and broken trust in relationships. That can happen at the first connection. A young man sees a woman he thinks is beautiful and He thinks I would like to connect with her. She's open to a relationship and find out who she is. I wonder what her name is, some of the very early connections. But right away, the enemy starts speaking and say, oh, you're not good enough for her, or she won't look at you, she won't talk to you. So we listen to lies of the enemy that keep us from each other. And that can happen at a very basic level. Have you ever been walking down the street or through a mall and you see somebody and your eyes catch and you both look away? And neither of you is actually looking at each other, but as soon as your eyes meet, you feel uncomfortable. And so you look away. And then you're like, oh, that was awkward. I shouldn't have looked away. And then you look back and they're looking back, and then you look away again. And now you have this guilt hanging over you, like, oh my gosh, she's going to think I was checking her out or something. And all that happened was your eyes met in public. It's no big deal. It's not a sin. There's nothing happened, but it just coincidental that your eyes met. And there's this shame that keeps us from actually building that relationship, making a connection that might have happened. And so you think about how many times in life you've probably missed out on good friendships that could have happened because there was an initial bump, and that bump probably was the lying tongue of the enemy. Something to think about. Most of this happens at the subconscious level. We're not actually sitting there going, I wonder if I should have a relationship with this person. We just see somebody, we make a brief connection. That connection leads us to making another connection. And sometimes we feel like maybe this is not a safe situation, or maybe I'm uncomfortable here, and we break it off. When connections take place, we build relationship, but it's much more complicated than that because it's never just happening in a vacuum. When relationships take place, they involve other people, because each of us, when we come into a new relationship, brings prior relationships into it. And that causes us to really think about this connection. If I make a friend with this person, what will my family think? If I make a friendship with this person, what will my friends think? Will my friends accept this person into our group of friends, or will I have to keep this person separate from my friends? That might be just because of something about them that you know your friends won't like, or you think your friends won't like, or you convince yourself your friends won't like. You're sizing up whether it's safe to be a friend, not just on the basis of the good connection you have with them, but on the basis of the voices around you of the rest of your network. This is what we're talking about when we talk in this lesson about social networks. Will my group allow me to build this relationship? The same is happening with them. They're thinking, will my group or groups allow me to build my relationship with this person? And so there's some obstacles of social dynamics that have to be overcome. And as we've talked about before, those social dynamics have a lot to do with status and class and even ethnicity and gender. Obviously, there's certain rules of engagement that the culture has for engaging people. And if it's somebody who's your same gender or somebody who's the opposite gender, you have different rules of engagement and what's allowable and what would be considered as appropriate in making that connection. Do you have to have that conversation? And all sorts of other things coming in there. Ethnicity can play into this, because if you come from a very tight, closed ethnic community that sees it as inappropriate to marry outside of the ethnicity or to build a friendship outside of the ethnicity, then the wall of that ethnicity becomes a barrier that keeps the connection from taking place in the first place. Now, that's an obstacle when we move into another culture. We're talking to people in that other culture, trying to figure out how to make a relationship with them because we want to talk to them. We want to build a relationship with them because we care about people and we want to share the gospel with them. But there are barriers in their people group and their network of relationships that are dictating whether they are okay having a conversation with you or not, and whether it's an appropriate time or setting or place, and whether you're acting appropriately, if you're acting weird like some crazy foreigner. All sorts of things can disrupt the relationship at that point. Just think in terms of connections. We might say, are they so connected that they don't have time for me? That was junior high, remember? I really want to know that popular kid. Everybody thinks he's cool and everybody likes hanging around him, but he probably just doesn't have time for more relationships because he's so busy with the relationships he already has. It doesn't go verbally through your mind like that, but there's an emotional internal battle taking place about whether somebody could like you and whether somebody's too popular to befriend you or to be around you. Then there are also less noble things that take place. We might look at somebody and go, I'd like to get to know that person over there, and this person knows them. So I'm going to befriend this person and try to make a connection here, because I don't think I can get to that connection, but maybe they'll introduce me. And so we use some connections to get to other connections without actually being as sincere about that connection. That's something to take in consideration in sharing the gospel. You want to introduce somebody to Jesus. You want to preach the gospel to them. Are you only making a relationship with them for the purpose of speaking the gospel to them? Or do you care enough about them as a person to make a relationship in the first place? It's a question you should be asking yourself. I think we have to go from relationship. That brings us into this bigger idea of all the connections we make. And through that, we develop in our own lives what we would call our social network. This is the whole set of relationships we have Now, that term, social network, has been transferred to computer programs such as Instagram and Facebook. When we use the term social networks, we tend to think of social networking as being online, but the term actually predates that. The reason those are called social networks is they reflect what real social networks look like and work like real social networks. They actually have an ability to change social networks. Studies have been done that show that since Facebook, we know more about our friends' lives than we used to, and therefore have more context. So when you haven't seen your friend for 2 or 3 weeks, but you see him again, and you don't have to do as much catching up because you've been following them on Facebook, and you don't start the conversation with, hey, what have you been doing the last 3 weeks since we've seen each other? You start with, man, I'm sorry to hear about your grandmother, because you already have that information. Social networking can shortcut a lot of obstacles to building relationships, and people do meet and build relationships that way. There are drawbacks to it because it takes us away from the face-to-face. One of the worst things you can do is spend more time with your friends on Facebook than you do with the people of the culture that you're trying to reach with the gospel. If you spend so much time with your digital world that you don't have time for the people in your nearby world, you'll be far less effective in ministry. You have to make some choices. And it's a choice that your grandparents never had to make. It's a choice that I didn't have to make at your age. We didn't have that. We talked to the people we had right around us all the time. And we had a lot of conversation. Now we get together and you sit down with all your friends and everybody whips their phones out and everybody's chatting with somebody else other than the people they're present with. And that's the reality of our society. It's true all around the world. It does take us away from the relationships we have close at hand. So this is our social network. The network of friends we have includes those online people and can be enhanced by the online platform, but it can also be damaged by the online platform. It's through these networks that we get our identity. We get our identity through our kinship. We get our identity through our ethnicity. We get our identity through our status. We get our identity through our achievements. But we often get our identity through the relationships we have. We identify ourselves in terms of our relationships to others, what groups we're a part of, and how we relate to those groups. In North America, we tend to have very open networks made up of identity within multiple networks. We don't just have one network that gives us our identity. We have many networks that give us our identity. Whereas you could see that in a collective society, a single network would give you identity. It would be kinship-based as well. Because of our open networks, we have the ability to plug and play. If my group of friends does something weird, I can just break off from the group and go find another group of friends. It might take time to make the connections and build a new group. Or I might have multiple groups of friends, and I just decide to disconnect from one group of friends and focus on another group of friends. And that's because we have huge branches of our network into many different directions. A tribal society or peasant society doesn't have that privilege or ability. And that's something to consider when you're working among least reached peoples. Can they actually add a new friend? Are they at capacity for friendship? When you say, I want to be your friend, but they have so many tight social network relationships to maintain that adding one more person is probably a bit overwhelming. And that's true in some cultures where they carefully consider whether it's worth investing in you as a foreigner who's going to leave in a few months, especially when you tell them, oh, yeah, I'm here for 3 months. To you, that's a long time. And they're like, huh, yeah, that's just reality. And you probably would do the same without really even thinking about it. And they don't say it out loud either. But you're trying to build friendships with people who probably don't need your friendship and have lots of friends already, are glad to meet a foreigner, but not sure they want to be a friend. And it makes it hard as a foreigner, as the outsider. It makes it hard to break in. And that's probably some of the things you may be experiencing, is that difficulty of breaking into the social networks around you. And so then what we end up doing is we revert to our own social networks. We hang out with the people who are more like us, hang out with our team, and we start neglecting it and stop pushing into those relationships. And if we're going to be effective, we're just going to have to engage. We're going to have to push into relationships, even if it's uncomfortable for us, even if it's hard. All right, so the way these social networks work, a fellow by the name of Barbasi wrote a great book called Linked, The New Science of Networks. In that, he looked at social networks and how they work, and he talked about several principles that govern social networks. The first principle, he said, is simply that a simple but continuous growth pattern of addition of one node at a time exists within all networks. In other words, networks grow simply by adding new people one by one. Generally speaking, it's not adding large groups of people at a time, but one person at a time. Somebody in the network makes a new relationship, and then the network has to readjust and decide, is that going to be the relationships that we have? If this new person is invited by the first person into the network, immediately now he has the opportunity for networking relationships within the first person's network group. Each of the people within that network group now are having to evaluate, is this somebody I want to stay connected with? Yeah, it's a friend of Paul's, but is it somebody I need to bother with friendship with? Sometimes we meet our friends' and we want to be friends with those friends too. And sometimes we meet our friends' and we're like, no, not so much. There's assessment taking place, and that determines whether the person builds a deep relationship with me. If they can't be friends with my friends, it creates an obstacle for my friendship with them. Am I letting them into the network? But if I let them in the network, I know that by bringing them into the network, my friends have to make an evaluation on whether they belong in the network as well. The rest of the network has to answer to it. The second principle he talks about is a tendency towards preferential attachments. The new member of the network will have a tendency toward preferential attachments that new nodes link to the most connected existing nodes, giving rise to highly connected nodes. In network science, they talk about this as being a hub. So if you're the most connected person in the network and everybody kind of knows each other, but you know everybody well, everybody knows you well, that makes you a hub within that network. And very often in social networks, what you see is that a network, a friend group kind of revolves around one person. And one person kind of keeps everything moving, keeps everything going. And everybody looks to that person. We call that leadership. But it's also the most connected person. I say that because often the person appointed as a leader isn't as well connected. And so you often have within a group an official leader, especially in an organization. You might have somebody chosen as a team leader or a department leader, but somebody else in the department is actually more connected than that person. And people look to them as influential, even though they're not the leader. So networks have these hubs, and then these hubs are driven by what he calls fitness connectivity. And that fitness connectivity is the product of the node's fitness and the number of links it has. So that's the technical jargon. In other words, a hub is not just based on the number of connections you have, but on the feeling of the people in those connections that you are worth connecting to. And so you become a hub because you're worth connecting to. There's a value to being connected to you. So in terms of social networking platforms like Instagram and Facebook, it's not enough just to have a lot of friends on social networks, right? You have to link content and create content that's valuable to others and makes them want to be connected to you. There's got to be a value to connecting to you. And that's how social networks work. In terms of the internet, there are also preferred nodes. The internet works with similar dynamics. Varavasi says that one of the most preferred nodes in the internet, if you think about it, is, Google. It has a high level of fitness connectivity. It is a preferential hub. It is a desired connection for everybody to have. If you build a website, you want it connected to Google because you want Google to be able to find you so that Google can tell others about you. And that's the way that works. In the same way, social networks work with preferred nodes with high levels of fitness. This is an actual social network diagram of a group of people. There's a program that you can plug relationships in, and then you can list the people they're friends with, and it'll map it all out like this and show you a great tool that anthropologists use to study social networks. And you could do it simply. You could draw a similar diagram of the people within your community and who knows who, how they're related, and who's friends with who. This is quite an extensive diagram. Some things about it is, of course, obviously each dot is a person, and then each line represents a relationship to other people. And so here are also a number of people who are highly connected, represented by larger dots. You can also see the color going out from them. Some people are connected mostly to one color, a small social network within the larger network. Some people are connected to multiple networks. You might have a blue with connections to a green, red, light blue, and a purple. These are people highly connected within the larger social network. Some are more isolated to a piece of that social network. And that happens with what we call friend groups within a larger group. So you had church youth group in high school, and you went to church youth group, and you had the whole church youth group, and that was the network you were part of. But within the church youth group, like mine, which is over 100 kids coming to church every Wednesday night, I found about 8 people that I spent most of my time with. That was my friend group within the larger network. I knew other people in other friend groups, but most of my connections were within that smaller friend group. All right, so there's a couple other things that we should talk about the way social networks work. A couple different studies that have been done on social networks and social interaction give us a bit of understanding. One is a concept that came from Stanley Milgram, and he called it small worlds. Think about it this way. Have you ever had the instance where you met someone and in conversation with them found out that you had a friend in common? You think, oh, it's a small world. And especially if that's across miles. I remember having a conversation with a missionary from another organization while I was in the Philippines who knew somebody who'd gone to Bethany years before. I thought, wow, way out here in the Philippines, I'm meeting somebody who knows me. Well, obviously, it's a network. When you join the larger network of missionaries around the world, you get connections that are surprising. It's quite a tight-knit group. It creates a sense of a small world. David Haas and Mike Mensch were in California. They had stopped at a coffee shop for breakfast. During that breakfast, they were having a conversation, and a young woman overheard the conversation. And she happens to be a friend of mine who was a student of Bethany back in 2001. She was overhearing this conversation, so she casually asked if they happened to be pastors because of what they were talking about. They introduced themselves and said, yeah, we're from Minnesota. She goes, oh, I went to school in Minnesota. She said, I went to this little school in Bloomington that nobody knows about or something like that. And Dehan says, I'm president of that school. She reached out to me on Facebook right away and said, guess what happened to me today? Posted it on Facebook. And so, there's these random events that sometimes happen that, like, how in the world do these two people having coffee at the same coffee shop happen to have something in common? Well, what Milgram says in his small world theories is that the connections between us are actually pretty tight and pretty frequent to anyone on the planet. And what Milgram did was he conducted an experiment known as the small world experiment. And basically what he did was he gave a package to people in places like Omaha, Nebraska. And it had a name of a person in Boston on the package. This person in Boston in the name. And they were told that they had to think about who they might give that package to that might help them to get it to that person in Boston. And so people think about the connections that they had and would send that package to that person with the same instructions. Think about somebody you know. No address was given on the package. Think about somebody you know that might know somebody. People think, well, I know somebody in Boston, so I'm going to get it to Boston. Well, once it gets to Boston, people start thinking, I don't know who knows somebody, but maybe this person knows that person. And they do some asking around. And in the experiment, a lot of packages never made it. But of the packages that made it, into the average number of times that the package changed hands from one person to another to get to that person was only 5.4. This is where we get our phrase 6 degrees of separation from that experiment. The conclusion was that at least within America, you're only 6 people away from anybody else. Now that's gone on to, is that true around the planet? And of course, there's cultural boundaries and geopolitical boundaries that don't make it as easy to connect 6 ways to somebody else, but it's actually pretty close to that. This idea that kind of became popularized as the idea that we live in a small, highly interconnected world. And with the exception of some smaller people groups that are more isolated from others, the average connection between every person on the planet is only 6 people. So from you to that person who does not know the gospel today, you're only 6 steps away. This has been popularized, and you can still look this up. It's on the internet still. It's called the Oracle of Bacon. And it started off as somebody responding to this, and they started mapping out social networks within Hollywood. And they used the IMDb database for it. And what they did was they said, okay, who has been in a movie with somebody else? That's 1 degree of separation. This image I have here is 2 degrees of separation. Sean Connery was in the movie Playing by Heart with Jay Moore, who was also in the movie Picture Perfect with Kevin Bacon. And so the score between Sean Connery and Kevin Bacon is 2. And the original experiment was to put Kevin Bacon at the center and find out how many steps removed was every person in Hollywood just on the basis of having started the movie with them. And what they found was the average of all the actors in Hollywood that are in the database who had started movies with each other, the average distance between Kevin Bacon and all other actors was 3.1. So only 3 movies away. Samuel Jackson is only 2.89 connected between himself and all other actors. There are a couple people at the fringe who have a score of up to 10 or 11, but they won't mention who they are because they don't want to humiliate them. Similarly, Henry Louis Gates Jr. had a PBS TV show called Finding Your Roots and interviewed people to analyze the genetic results from 23andMe. This is a diagram of some of the guests who appeared on the show in their relationship to other guests. And so you see some really interesting connections here. Condoleezza Rice is 4th cousin with somebody who's also 4th cousin with Kevin Bacon. You have Robert Downey Jr. is a 4th cousin of Harry Connick Jr. and of Barbara Walters. Martha Stewart and Samuel L. Jackson, 8 steps removed. Rick Warren is related to Samuel L. Jackson. These people actually have a connection through genetics, through kinship with each other that you wouldn't even imagine are connected. It's a very interesting map of relationships. It shows how highly interconnected the world we live in is and how interconnected we are as people. Another concept, and this came up in the article I asked you to read, is the concept of weak ties. And this comes out of Mark Granovitter's study where he looked at how people build opportunity. And what he found was that social networks have a tendency to grow tight and cloistered. You can see that. We actually have a phrase, right? We sometimes talk about being in the bubble. A tight network of friends that think and act alike and begin to do more things alike. Click is another name for that tight network. And tight networks tend to get ingrown. They tend to forget how to be innovative because they just focus in on maintaining the ties within the network. But everybody within the network has connections outside of the network into other networks. And so even though this is your main friend group, you actually have people you know in other friend groups. The connection between you and other friend groups, Granovetter called a weak tie. It's also in the article you read, bridge or tunnel, this concept of weak ties. The article goes into much more detail about it, and I encourage you to read that. One of the things he showed was that the best way to get a new job is not through your own social network, but pushing outside of your social network, using the weak tie into another network. Your network has already saturated you with ideas for where to get that job. How do you get a new job? You reach beyond the network you're currently a part of, and you might get an opportunity that you otherwise wouldn't get. The idea of innovation comes in there, that through our weak ties to other networks, we actually become more innovative. That concept, I tried to map it out a little bit here. It shows the potential strength of using the weakest links to push oneself beyond your own network. Weak ties then are social space connections that allow the flow of information. So here's somebody within the network connecting to somebody else within their network, connecting to somebody outside that network who connects to somebody in another network. And through that, information now flows between the two networks through the weakest tie. And oftentimes there may be resistance if you do it direct. From my network and I see a group of friends over there and I want to connect with them, there might be resistance. But if you can connect with somebody who is connected to them and bridge that with that person, you sometimes bridge that social space. And oftentimes weak ties are more open to close ties because within the network, we have a lot of baggage and we don't let people know that we're not doing well or that we're interested in something beyond what the network's interested in. You know, have you ever been in that situation where you're with your friend group and all of a sudden somebody brings politics up and they start trashing a politician and you're like, I don't agree with you, but I don't want to lose my friendship in the group, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. And then you start talking to somebody outside your network who does agree with you and isn't like the people in your network and disagrees with you. And that creates a weak tie that allows you to be influenced by people outside of your network. If you think about groups of friends that you've had, if you have friendship with people who are outside of your normal social strata, people who maybe aren't of the same religion that you grew up in, or people that aren't of the same ethnicity or from the same school, you probably started that relationship through some sort of weak tie, not through the strong tie. Weak ties allow you to expand your social network. So what are you supposed to be doing when you're on the field? You're supposed to be expanding your social network, using the opportunity of the idea that there are people who you can connect with outside of the social network that you came out to the field with, outside of the social network of missionaries on the field. There are people who you have the opportunity to connect with and build a relationship with, but they're weak ties, they're not strong ties. So you have to work harder at building that relationship. Even though a tight network is more resistant to change, weak ties allow influential change. Resistant, unreached people will be more open to change through weak links than through strong links. A lot of that happens both ways. You think about a lot of social change that happens that way. Viral videos pass through small world phenomena and strong and weak links. Your friend of a friend of a friend posts something on Facebook and it gets back to you. You don't know that person, but they post content that you like. And all of a sudden there's a sense of relationship. I should follow this person because I want more of this content. Social networks and friendships work the same way. So how does that impact us? What does that mean to us as followers of Jesus? Well, think of it with evangelism in mind. Evangelism works through social networks. And within the network, as a group of people become followers of Jesus, new members are added, usually through weak ties. And those new members are attracted to people with gifts, talents, and skills within a group of Christians who everybody tries to connect with. It might be the pastor of a church, it might be a youth group leader, it might be a prominent person within the social network of Christian friends. Somebody who's really good at discipleship, knows a lot about the Bible, and everybody's trying to connect to them. Generally speaking, the new members are coming out of very small connections, not out of the church. We're not making converts from within the network that exists. We're looking for people outside of that network. And so we are looking for weak ties. And when we're talking about reaching into resistant or unreached people groups, it's that weak tie that allows us to bridge the gospel into the group. And thinking about movements, we often call this a person of peace or people of peace. They're people that are open enough to hear what you have to say, and they're open enough to open a door to their network for you. That allows the gospel to have a hearing. So that's why we look for people like that. We're looking for bridges that allow us as the outsider to bridge into the group. And that's by making new contacts, new friendships every day, looking for people and being out there, putting ourselves out there, engaging the culture in such a way that we make strong connections with people who we otherwise wouldn't have connected with. While they may not come to Jesus, they may open their social network to you for people that will come to Jesus as a result of your relationship with the first person you connected with. So every relationship you build during your time on the field is a worthy relationship because it's an opportunity for the gospel to flow into a new area. And then remember this, that the distance between the average person and the gospel is likely less than 6 connections. And the flow of the gospel tends to go that way, not necessarily saturating a network, but passing through existing relationship sets in a culture. So when you choose to engage a culture at a deep level, by becoming intercultural, by being willing to learn how to live within that culture, you reduce the number of connections between those people and the gospel. That's exciting. And that's what missions is all about. Network Connections are created by establishing context, building relationships. That's why cold evangelism and mass evangelism, while it's effective, is generally less successful and less impactful than relational evangelism because it lacks the relational connection that establishes trust, which allows the message to gain foothold. So relational evangelism builds bridges by establishing and maximizing context to build trust. You build trust, you build context, and that's where the gospel flows. Because in that connection with the person of peace, we build bridges strong enough to bear the weight of the truth. God bless you as you continue to serve him and being those bridges. Have a great week.